Close your eyes and think about the one moment in your life you were certain no one was watching. A moment of private grief, a secret habit, or a silent fear. Now imagine a voice on the phone describing that exact moment back to you in a tone so intimate it feels like a caress. Woodsboro is back, but the rules have changed. The killer doesn't just want Sidney Prescott's life, he wants to inhabit her mind. Are you ready to watch a masterpiece of obsession unfold? Before we dive into the polished madness of the new Woodsboro, hit that like button and subscribe to join our circle of survivors. Comment your city of origin and type, "I'm watching," to let us know you've arrived. The air in Woodsboro didn't smell like blood anymore, it smelled of jasmine and expensive mulch. The town had undergone a cosmetic surgery of the soul, replacing its jagged history with gated communities and boutiques that sold artisanal candles. Sidney Prescott stood by her floor-to-ceiling windows, the cool glass a stark contrast to the humid heavy night pressing against the outside of her home. She wore a robe of charcoal silk that clung to her skin like a second thought, the fabric sliding with a rhythmic liquid hiss every time she moved. At 40-something, Sidney wasn't just a survivor, she was an architect of her own solitude. She had built this life with the precision of a fortress, yet as she swirled a glass of vintage Merlot, she felt the familiar low-voltage hum of hypervigilance vibrating under her ribs. It was a physical sensation, a craving for a peace she knew was a lie. The house was too quiet. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, almost tactile, like a hand resting lightly on the nape of her neck. She took a sip of the wine, letting the tart heat of it bloom in her throat. She found herself staring at her own reflection in the darkened glass, tracing the lines of her collarbone. She looked older, yes, but there was a sharpness to her beauty now, a blade that had been tempered until it was elegant. The phone didn't ring with the jarring, shrill tone of the 90s. It was a soft, melodic pulse, a modern chime that felt more like an invitation than an alarm. Sidney didn't rush. She let it pulse 3 times, the sound echoing through the minimalist hallway. She picked it up, her thumb grazing the smooth screen. She didn't say hello. She waited, her own breath caught in the back of her throat, a secret she wasn't ready to share. "You sound tired, Sidney," the voice said. It wasn't the raspy, distorted snarl she had heard in her nightmares. It was lower, smooth. It had the quality of velvet pulled over a serrated edge. It was a voice that sounded like it belonged in a bedroom, whispered into the hollow of an ear during the deepest part of the night. "Did you miss me?" Sidney's pulse quickened, not with the frantic beat of a victim, but with the heavy, thudding recognition of a long-lost lover. The intimacy of the tone was more invasive than a knife. It suggested a closeness she hadn't authorized, a knowledge of her body and her habits that made the silk of her robe feel suddenly, suffocatingly tight. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice steady, though she could feel the heat rising in her chest. "A student of the craft," the voice replied, followed by a slow, deliberate intake of breath that sounded like a caress. "I've been watching the way you move through this house, Sidney. So careful. So guarded. You walk like a woman who expects to be touched, but fears she might enjoy the sting." The ambiguity of the threat sent a shiver down her spine that felt disturbingly like a thrill. It was the soap opera drama of her life returning to claim her, wrapped in a new, seductive skin. This wasn't a game of hide and seek, it was a game of exposure. "The police are a 5-minute drive away," she lied, her eyes scanning the dark tree line beyond her lawn. "But I'm already much closer than that," the voice whispered, the intimacy of the sound making her feel exposed, as if the caller could see the way her skin pebbled in the air-conditioned chill. "I'm in the silence between your heartbeats. I'm the reason you don't sleep without the lights on. I don't want to break your heart, Sidney. I want to see what's inside it." The line didn't go dead. It lingered. She could hear the faint, rhythmic breathing on the other end, controlled, patient, and utterly attentive. It was the sound of someone who wasn't just planning a murder, but an encounter. Sidney lowered the phone, her hand trembling just enough to make the wine in her glass ripple. She looked back at the window. The polished life she had built felt like a thin veil, and someone, was finally reaching out to tear it away. The morning sun in Woodsboro was an intruder. It spilled across Sidney's white linen sheets with an aggressive cheerfulness that felt like a mockery of the whispered shadows from the night before. Sidney lay still, the charcoal silk of her robe now tangled around her thighs, her skin still humming with a residual restless heat. The voice hadn't threatened to kill her, it had threatened to know her. And in the daylight, that felt like a far more dangerous violation. She dressed with the clinical precision of a soldier preparing for a gala. A tailored cream blazer, dark jeans, and boots that clicked against the hardwood with a lethal rhythmic certainty. She didn't look like a victim, she looked like an executioner. The news broke before she had finished her first cup of coffee. Councilman Arthur Miller, the man who had championed the Woodsboro Renaissance and fought to turn the site of the original Macker House into a luxury wellness retreat, had been found dead in his study. The reports were vague, calling it a tragedy, but Sydney knew the cadence of this town's secrets. She knew that tragedy was the word Woodsboro used when the truth was too ugly for the brochures. When she arrived at the Miller estate, the air was thick with the scent of expensive boxwood and the ionized tang of police radios. The house was a glass and steel monstrosity, a transparent cage that offered no place to hide. Sheriff Mark Vane was waiting for her near the cordoned-off entrance. He was younger than Sydney, with a jawline that looked like it had been carved from granite and eyes that lingered on her a second too long to be purely professional. There was a magnetic, almost predatory curiosity in the way he watched her approach. "I told my deputies you'd show up," Vane said, his voice a low drawl that vibrated in the humid air. He stepped closer, invading her personal space just enough to be felt. "You have a sixth sense for the macabre, Sydney. Or maybe it's just that the macabre has a crush on you." "Show me," Sydney replied, ignoring the bait. Her voice was a cold blade, slicing through the performative concern of the officers around them. Vane led her into the study. The room was a sanctuary of dark leather and mahogany, but the atmosphere had shifted. It felt heavy, saturated with a lingering, invisible presence. Councilman Miller was slumped in his high-backed Eames chair. There was very little blood, none of the chaotic spray of a typical Ghostface attack. This was curated. Miller's throat had been opened with a single surgical stroke, but it was the arrangement of the body that made Sydney's breath hitch. His hands were folded over his chest, clutching a single, dried white lily. The flower was brittle, its edges browned by years, not days. "It's from a funeral," Sydney whispered, stepping closer. The scent of the room wasn't of death, but of something ancient and preserved. A cloyingly sweet perfume hung in the air, the exact scent her mother Maureen used to wear. "We found something else," Vane said, his voice dropping to a near whisper as he moved behind her. She could feel the heat of his body radiating against her back, a subtle dominant pressure. He reached around her, not touching, but close enough that the air between them became electric, and pointed to the desk. Lying next to the councilman's cooling hand was a small, silver locket. It was open. Inside wasn't a photo, but a small scrap of paper with a single word written in an elegant flowing script, "Watching." The sexual elements of the scene weren't in the violence, but in the meticulous, almost fetishistic way the killer had handled the environment. The placement of the flower, the choice of scent, the way the body had been posed to look as if it were in a state of post-coital repose, it was an act of intimacy. The killer hadn't just ended Miller's life, they had used his body to send a love letter to Sydney. "This wasn't a murder," Sydney said, her eyes tracing the curve of the councilman's cold fingers. "It was an invitation." She turned, finding herself inches from Vane's chest. The sheriff didn't move back. He looked down at her, his gaze dark and unreadable. "An invitation to what, Sydney? A dance? Or a wake?" "To a reckoning," she said, her voice dropping to a sultry, dangerous register. As she walked away, the glass walls of the house seemed to pulse with the reflection of the surrounding woods. She felt a prickle of heat on the back of her neck, the unmistakable sensation of eyes tracing the line of her spine, appreciative and hungry. The killer wasn't copycatting the past, they were romancing it. And as Sydney stepped back out into the bright, deceptive Woodsboro sun, she realized the polished surface of her life hadn't just been cracked. It was being peeled away, layer by layer, by someone who wanted to see exactly what she looked like when she was finally, utterly exposed. The scent of Maureen Prescott's perfume, that cloying floral ghost, clung to Sydney's skin long after she left the Miller estate. She had scrubbed her neck until the skin turned a raw, angry pink, yet the fragrance seemed to have moved inside her, settling in the back of her throat. It was a sensory invasion, a reminder that her past wasn't a closed book, it was a living, breathing entity that had decided to crawl into bed with her. Chapter 3 opens in the late afternoon, that golden hour where the light turns thick and syrupy, casting long, distorted shadows across Sydney's living room. She was no longer in her blazer. She had retreated into a thin, oversized cashmere sweater that slipped off one shoulder, exposing the sharp line of her collarbone. She held a glass of water with trembling fingers, watching the way the condensation tracked slow, weeping lines down the crystal. The doorbell didn't ring. Instead, there was a soft rhythmic thud against the heavy oak of her front door, not a knock of urgency, but a deliberate heavy sound, like the brush of a body against wood. When Sydney opened the door, the porch was empty. The air was still, save for the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. But there, resting exactly where her shadow fell, was an envelope. It wasn't standard stationery. The paper was heavy, vellum-like, and cream-colored, smelling faintly of old cedar and something metallic. Her name was written on the front in a script so elegant it felt like a caress, "For my final girl." She retreated into the house, locking the door with a sequence of clicks that felt increasingly futile. She sat at her kitchen island, the marble cold beneath her thighs, and used a silver letter opener to slit the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. There was no "I'm going to kill you." There was no "Do you like scary movies?" Instead, the words were an observation of a moment Sydney thought had belonged only to her. 3 years ago, on a Tuesday in November, you sat on the floor of your closet and held a blue sweater to your face for 42 minutes. You didn't cry. You just breathed. I watched the way your shoulders moved, the way you almost let go, but didn't. You're so beautiful when you think you're alone. You're even more beautiful when you're waiting for someone to find you. A wave of heat, sharp and dizzying, flooded Sydney's system. It wasn't just fear, it was a profound, sickening sense of being known. This was the seduction of fear taking root. The killer wasn't just a stalker, they were a voyeur of her soul. The detail about the blue sweater, her father's sweater, was something no one could have known. Not the police, not her closest friends. The letter continued, the ink looking dark and wet, as if it had just been laid down. I love the way you lock your doors, Sydney. It shows you still have hope. But we both know that locks only keep out the people who don't care enough to break them. I care. I care about every breath you take. I wonder, if I were standing behind you right now, would you freeze? Or would you lean back into me? The ambiguity was a physical weight. The letter moved between a threat and a dark, twisted flirtation. It suggested a desire that was inextricable from destruction. Sydney stood up, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt the sudden, irrational urge to strip, to check every inch of her skin for the invisible marks of this person's gaze. She felt exposed in her own home, the open-plan architecture now feeling like a stage where she was the only performer for an audience of one. She reached for her phone to call Vane, but her hand paused. If she called the police, the intimacy of the letter would become a public record. It would be analyzed, photocopied, and discussed. The thought of Vane's dark, hungry eyes reading those words, reading about her closet, her grief, her body, felt like another kind of violation. Just as she was about to set the letter down, she noticed something on the back. A small, hand-drawn map. It wasn't a map of a place, but a diagram of her own house, with one room circled in a soft red ink. The bedroom. Below the circle, a final line, I've left something under your pillow. Something to help you dream of me. Sydney moved toward the stairs, her movements sluggish, as if she were walking through water. Every shadow in the hallway seemed to reach for her. The air in the house had grown thick, the silence now vibrating with a predatory energy. She reached her bedroom door, her hand hovering over the handle. She pushed it open. The room was bathed in the dying red light of the sunset. Her bed was made, the linens crisp and undisturbed. With a shaking hand, she reached under the pillow on the left side, the side she slept on. Her fingers closed around something cold and hard. She pulled it out. It was a small vintage glass bottle of the perfume she had smelled at the crime scene. But it wasn't full of perfume. It was half filled with a dark viscous liquid that caught the last rays of the sun. And tied around the neck of the bottle was a lock of hair, dark, slightly curled, and unmistakably her own, taken perhaps while she slept. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The killer hadn't just been in her house, they had been in her bed. The horror was no longer at the gates. It was under the covers. She dropped the bottle, and as it shattered against the hardwood, the scent of jasmine and iron filled the room, a seductive, suffocating promise of what was to come. The Woodsboro Historical Archive was a sanctuary of hushed tones and temperature-controlled air, a place where the past was filed away in acid-free boxes and kept under lock and key. For Sydney, it was the only place that felt sterile enough to breathe in. Her own home had become a stage for someone else's performance, a place where her own hair was used as a trophy. Here, surrounded by the weight of 1,000 other stories, she hoped to find the thread of her own. She sat at a secluded mahogany table in the back, the light from a green-shaded banker's lamp casting a jaundiced glow over the records of the 1996 killings. She was looking for the silver locket. She was looking for the perfume. She was looking for a ghost that had finally learned how to touch. The problem with looking back, a voice said, emerging from the rows of floor-to-ceiling shelves, is that eventually, the past starts looking back at you. Sydney didn't flinch. She had spent a lifetime expecting the jump scare, but this wasn't that. The man who stepped into the light didn't move like a predator, he moved like someone who was exactly where he was supposed to be. He was composed, wearing a charcoal turtleneck that hugged a frame that was lean but deceptively strong. His face was a study in symmetry, intelligent, calm, with eyes that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. "I'm Julian," he said, his voice a rich baritone that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of her bones. "I'm the visiting consultant for the town's legacy project. Or, as the locals call it, the man who cleans up the mess." He didn't stand at a polite distance. He walked until he was just on the edge of her personal space, his presence a warm front against her cold, guarded exterior. He didn't look at the gruesome photos on the table. He looked at her. "You're Sydney Prescott," he said. It wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement of a monument. "I've spent the last 6 months reading about you. But the ink doesn't do you justice. You have a formidable energy." "Is that the professional term for traumatized?" Sydney asked, her voice a sharp, defensive snap. Julian smiled, and it was a slow, devastatingly handsome unfolding of his features. "It's the term for someone who has survived the fire and turned into diamond. Most people come here to gawk at the tragedy. You're here because you're looking for the why behind the how." He pulled out the chair next to her, not across from her, but beside her. As he sat, the scent of him reached her. It wasn't the floral ghost of her mother's perfume. It was something deeper, sandalwood, expensive leather, and a hint of something sharp and clean, like rain on hot asphalt. It was an overwhelmingly masculine scent, one that cut through the musty smell of the archive and made her suddenly, acutely aware of the proximity of his thigh to hers. "I noticed the way you were looking at those crime scene sketches," Julian continued, leaning in. He pointed to a photo of the silver locket, his finger hovering just an inch above the paper. His hand was large, the skin smooth, his nails perfectly manicured. "You're looking for a pattern. But this killer isn't following a pattern. They're following a person." "You seem to know a lot about it for someone who just got to town," Sydney said, her eyes tracing the line of his jaw. She felt a strange, traitorous pulse in her throat, a mixture of suspicion and a primal, magnetic pull she couldn't quite name. "I study human behavior, Sydney. Especially the behavior of those who are obsessed with strength." He turned his head to look at her, their faces so close she could see the flecks of gold in his dark irises. "This person doesn't want to break you. Breaking something is easy. They want to own the way you survive. There's a profound intimacy in that. A dark kind of adoration." The word adoration hung in the air, heavy and charged. Sydney felt a heat rising in her chest, the kind of flush that usually preceded a fight, but this felt different. It was the soap opera tension of a woman being seen too clearly by a man who shouldn't know her at all. Julian reached out, his hand hesitating before he lightly brushed a stray lock of hair away from her face. His touch was electric, a brief, searing contact that made her skin tingle. "You're shivering," he whispered, his eyes dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to hers. "Is it fear, Sydney? Or is it just that you haven't been touched by someone who isn't trying to hurt you in a long time?" The ambiguity of the statement was a direct hit. It was a duel of words, a psychological dance where the steps were becoming increasingly blurred. Was he a savior, or was he the one who had left her hair under her pillow? The way he watched her, calm, attentive, almost worshipful, mirrored the tone of the voice on the phone, but wrapped in the safety of a handsome face and a soft-lit room. "I should go," Sydney said, though she didn't move. Her body felt heavy, anchored by the gravity of his presence. "Stay," Julian said, his voice a low command that felt like a caress. "Let me help you find what you're looking for. Or perhaps, let me help you forget why you're looking for it, just for an hour." He leaned in closer, the space between them disappearing until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, mistaken for attraction, or perhaps a dark fusion of both. For the first time in years, Sydney felt the mask of the final girl slip, revealing a woman who was tired of being strong. And as Julian's hand moved to rest on the table, his pinky finger just barely grazing her own, she realized the most dangerous thing in Woodsboro wasn't a knife, it was the feeling of being understood. The gilded bean was the crown jewel of the new Woodsboro, a cathedral of white marble, reclaimed wood, and the expensive hum of high-end espresso machines. It was a place where trauma went to be caffeinated and forgotten. Sydney sat at a small bistro table near the floor-to-ceiling window, a position that allowed her to see everyone entering while keeping her back to a solid brick pillar. It was a habit she couldn't break, a survival instinct that felt increasingly like a tether. She was dressed in a silk blouse the color of bruised plums, the fabric so light it felt like a second skin, shivering against her whenever the air conditioning kicked in. After the encounter with Julian in the archives, her body felt hypersensitized. Every brush of her own clothing, every stray glance from a stranger, felt like a deliberate touch. She had come here to prove to herself that she could still exist in the light, that she wasn't just a ghost haunting her own life. Across the square, the town was performing its daily ritual of normalcy. Mothers pushed strollers, joggers moved with rhythmic, athletic grace. It was a tableau of safety so perfect it felt brittle. Then, her phone pulsed on the marble tabletop. It wasn't a call from an unknown number this time. The screen remained dark, but a localized Bluetooth alert popped up, a request to share a file. Sydney's heart did a slow, heavy roll in her chest. She looked around. The cafe was half full. A woman in a yoga outfit was typing on a laptop, 2 businessmen were arguing over a spreadsheet, a barista was steaming milk with a loud rhythmic hiss. She tapped accept. The file was a live video stream. It took a second to buffer, and then Sydney felt the blood drain from her face. The camera was pointed at her. From the angle, it was clear the person was sitting only 3 tables away, obscured by a large potted palm. The video was high definition, capturing the slight tremor in her hand as she reached for her coffee, the way the silk of her blouse strained across her shoulders as she tensed. The phone began to ring. She answered it before the first chime could finish. "Don't move, Sydney," the voice whispered. It was even more intimate today, the sound filtered through the digital connection until it felt like it was originating from inside her own head. "I want to watch this. I want to see that moment when the realization hits you. The way your pupils dilate. The way your breath just stops." Sydney sat perfectly still. She felt a cold sweat break out along the curve of her spine. "You're here," she breathed, her voice barely a thread. "I'm everywhere you are," the voice replied, a low melodic hum of satisfaction. "You have this magnificent way of freezing right before you fight back. It's a moment of pure, unadulterated vulnerability. Most people think it's fear, but I know better. It's an opening. A surrender." The sexual undertone was unmistakable, a dark voyeuristic appreciation of her trauma response that felt like a physical violation. The voice wasn't talking about killing her, he was talking about the pleasure of her helplessness. It was the ultimate soap opera betrayal. Her body was reacting to the danger with a heightened electric awareness that felt disturbingly close to arousal. "Look at the man in the blue shirt," the voice commanded. Sydney's eyes flicked to the businessman at the counter. He was middle-aged, unremarkable, checking his watch with an air of impatient boredom. "Now look at the woman with the stroller." She was laughing into her phone, adjusted a pacifier with practiced ease. "Any one of them could be me," the voice whispered. "I could be the one who just brushed past your chair. I could be the one who made your coffee. I could be the one who's imagining exactly what your skin feels like under that silk. You're so guarded, Sydney, but you're also so visible. I can see the pulse in your neck from here. It's racing. Is that because you're afraid, or because you're finally feeling alive again?" "You're a coward," Sydney spat, though the words felt hollow. She scanned the room, her gaze resting for a moment on every face, looking for a crack in the mask. "I'm a connoisseur," the voice corrected. "The others, Billy, Stu, they were clumsy. They wanted the ending. I want the middle. I want the tension. I want the way you look when you're cornered and you realize that the only person who truly understands you is the one holding the knife." The video feed on her phone zoomed in. It focused on her lips, which were parted slightly as she struggled for air. Then the camera panned down, tracing the line of her throat to where the first button of her blouse had come undone, revealing the frantic beat of her heart against her pale skin. "You're strongest when you're cornered, Sydney," the voice said, echoing the sentiment he had shared in the letters. "I wonder how close I need to stand to see that strength break. I wonder if you'll fight me, or if you'll finally just let me in." The line went dead. The video feed cut to black, replaced by a single text message: "I love the way you taste the air when you're hunted." Sydney looked up, her eyes wide and searching. For a split second, she thought she saw a flash of charcoal fabric disappearing behind the palm tree, a silhouette that reminded her hauntingly of Julian. But when she stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the marble, there was no one there. The cafe continued its polished suburban performance, oblivious to the fact that its most famous resident had just been stripped bare in the middle of the afternoon. She walked out into the sun, the heat of the day feeling like a cold hand. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a prize. And as she looked at the reflection of the town in the glass windows, she realized that the polished facade wasn't there to protect her. It was there to make sure she had nowhere to hide when the intimacy finally became lethal. Gemini said. The drive back to her house felt like navigating a dream where the scenery was familiar, but the physics were wrong. Every headlight in her rearview mirror was a pair of searching eyes, every pedestrian on the sidewalk was a shadow waiting to lengthen. By the time Sydney pulled into her driveway, the sun was sinking into a bruised purple horizon, casting long skeletal fingers across her manicured lawn. Her home, once a masterpiece of modern security and glass-walled transparency, now looked like a trap. It was a beautiful cage designed to show the world exactly where the bird was kept. She stepped inside, her hand instinctively hovering over the concealed holster in her waistband. The house was silent, but it wasn't empty. It lacked the hollow, still quality of a vacant space. Instead, the air felt displaced, as if someone had just walked through it, leaving a wake of disturbed molecules. Then she heard it. A soft, rhythmic hiss and pop. It was coming from the den. Sydney moved through the shadows of the hallway, her movements fluid and silent. She reached the doorway and froze. Her vintage record player, an heirloom she kept more for sentiment than use, was spinning. The needle was tracing the grooves of an old 1970s soul record, a song her mother, Maureen, used to play on Sunday mornings when the world felt safe. The music was low, a sultry, mournful croon about a love that wouldn't stay buried. But it wasn't just the music. On the low mahogany coffee table sat a single glass of Merlot. It was her favorite vintage, the bottle she had opened only 2 nights ago. A small dark smudge of crimson lipstick, the exact shade Sydney wore, was visible on the rim. The wine inside was still swirling slightly, as if it had just been set down. The violation was surgical. It wasn't the chaotic destruction of a home invasion, it was an act of domestic mimicry. Someone had sat in her chair, listened to her mother's music, and drank her wine. They had tried on her life like a costume. Sydney's breath hitched, the sound loud in the small room. She felt a sudden visceral heat blooming in her chest, a mixture of mounting terror and a strange intrusive intimacy. The killer wasn't just watching her, they were inhabiting her. She turned to leave the room, her mind racing toward the exit, when she saw the book. It was resting on the arm of her favorite reading chair. It was a copy of the Odyssey, open to the page where Penelope waits for a husband she no longer recognizes. A passage was underlined in the same elegant flowing script from the letters. "I am not the woman you remember, but I am the only one who knows the truth of you." A cold shiver raced down her spine, but it was accompanied by a traitorous pulse of adrenaline. The killer was courting her through her own history, using her trauma as a language of seduction. The ambiguity of it was suffocating. Was this hatred, or a warped lethal form of adoration? "Sydney." The voice came from the hallway, and Sydney spun around, her weapon drawn and leveled. Julian stood in the doorway. He was dressed in a dark overcoat, his hair slightly damp from the evening mist. He didn't flinch at the sight of the gun. He simply stood there, his expression a mask of calm, intelligent concern. "The front door was ajar," he said softly, his voice a low, steadying frequency. "I was coming to check on you after what happened at the cafe. I saw your car." Sydney didn't lower the gun. "How did you know where I lived, Julian?" "I'm the town historian for the Legacy Project, remember?" He took a slow, deliberate step into the room, his eyes moving from the gun to the spinning record. "Your address is a matter of public record for anyone who knows which archives to look in. But I didn't come here as a researcher. I came because I knew you'd be spiraling." He moved closer, ignoring the lethal threat in her hand. He stopped when the barrel of the gun was inches from his chest. He looked down at it, then up at her, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her throat go dry. "You're shaking, Sydney," he whispered. He reached out, his hand moving with agonizing slowness until his fingers brushed the back of her hand, the one holding the weapon. His skin was warm, a startling contrast to the cold steel of the gun. You've spent so long being the final girl that you've forgotten how to let someone else stand guard. The proximity was electric. The scent of him, sandalwood and rain, cut through the cloying floral ghost of the perfume that seemed to haunt the house. It was a masculine, grounded scent that promised a safety Sydney knew she shouldn't trust. Yet, as his hand closed over hers, gently easing the gun down, she felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. They were here, she breathed, her voice cracking. They drank my wine. They played my mother's music. I know, Julian said, his voice dropping to a sultry, protective register. He stepped into her space, his chest almost brushing her shoulders. They're trying to move inside your head because they can't get close enough to your heart. It's a game of exposure. They want to strip you down until there's nothing left but the fear. He reached up, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that felt dangerously like a caress. But fear is just another form of attention, isn't it? And you've been starved for the right kind of attention for a very long time. The ambiguity of his words sent a fresh jolt through her. Was he diagnosing her, or was he confessing? The line between the confidant and the killer was thinning, blurred by the shadows of the room and the mournful soul music still spinning on the turntable. In that moment, surrounded by the physical evidence of a breach, Sydney felt a terrifying urge to lean into him, to find out if the man holding her hand was the one who wanted to save her, or the one who wanted to own the moment she finally broke. The dawn that followed the intrusion was a pale, bruised violet, filtering through the skylights of Sydney's bedroom like an uninvited guest. She hadn't slept. She had spent the night wrapped in a heavy velvet throw, sitting in the corner of her room where she could see both the door and the window, her hand never straying far from the cold weight of her weapon. Julian had stayed. He had spent the night on the sofa downstairs, a silent sentinel whose presence was both a comfort and a question mark. When she finally descended the stairs, the house was filled with the scent of fresh coffee and the low rhythmic humming of a man at ease. Julian was in the kitchen, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were corded with subtle, powerful muscle. He moved with a domestic grace that felt predatory in its perfection. You should have rested, he said, not turning around, as if he could feel her presence by the way the air shifted. He poured a cup of coffee and set it on the marble island. A woman like you needs her strength for what's coming next. And what exactly is coming next, Julian? Sydney asked, her voice raspy from disuse. She wore a thin white slip dress, a garment that felt like a surrender to the heat of the house, and she saw his eyes travel the length of her, a slow, appreciative burn that made her skin prickle. Clarity, he replied. The clarity arrived 20 minutes later in the form of a frantic knocking at the door. It wasn't the killer. It was a young deputy, his face the color of parchment. Sheriff Mark Vane was dead. The news hit Sydney not with a shock, but with a sickening sense of inevitability. The gift had been delivered. Vane, the man who had looked at her with hungry professional curiosity, the man who represented the law's interference in this private duel, had been removed from the board. They found him in the town square, but the violence had been conducted with a terrifying, silent intimacy. There was no struggle, no evidence of a chase. He had been found sitting on a park bench, his head tilted back as if he were watching the stars. His throat had been opened with the same surgical precision as the councilman's, but his hands were empty. Instead, his wedding ring, a symbol of his life outside of Sydney's orbit, had been removed and placed on the tip of his tongue. The aftermath was invasive. The killer hadn't just killed the sheriff, they had staged him in a way that mocked his authority and highlighted his failure to protect her. To the town, it was a tragedy. To Sydney, it was a message: I have cleared the field. Now, there is no one left between us. When Sydney returned from the scene, the air in her home felt even more saturated. The polished life she had cultivated was now completely stripped away. She found Julian in the garden, standing near a patch of night-blooming jasmine. The scent was overwhelming, cloying and sweet, mixing with the metallic tang that seemed to follow her everywhere. He was in the way, Julian said softly as she approached. He didn't look at her, he looked at the flowers. In the way of what? Sydney demanded, stepping into his space. She felt a surge of rage, but beneath it was that dark electric current of attraction that Julian seemed to pull from her like a magnet. Julian turned, and the expression on his face was one of profound, almost religious devotion. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to cup her face. His thumb traced the dark circles under her eyes with an agonizingly slow, rhythmic pressure. "In the way of you seeing the truth," he whispered. "You've spent your whole life being hunted by men who wanted to destroy you. But this is different. This is a culling. The world is being simplified, Sydney. All the noise, all the people who pretend to care but only want a piece of your legend, they're being erased. So that you can finally be yourself." "And who am I, Julian?" she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs so loudly she thought he must be able to feel it through his palm. "You're the one who survives," he said, his voice dropping to a low, seductive growl. He leaned in, his lips inches from her ear. "And I'm the only one who truly knows what that cost you. I'm the only one who looks at you and doesn't see a victim or a hero. I see the fire. And I want to stand in it with you." The ambiguity of his words was a physical weight. He was speaking the language of the killer, yet he was the only thing that felt solid in a world that was dissolving into blood and jasmine. He pulled her closer, his other hand resting on the small of her back, the heat of his touch bleeding through the thin silk of her dress. It was a moment of peak soap opera tension, a woman standing in the arms of a man who might be her savior or her executioner, while the body of the man who tried to protect her was still cooling in the morgue. The fear didn't feel like fear anymore, it felt like a heightened state of existence, a dark, pulsing intimacy that Sydney realized she was starting to crave. "You're not afraid of me, are you, Sydney?" Julian asked, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. "I don't know what I am anymore," she admitted, her voice a fractured whisper. "Good," he said, a slow, dark smile spreading across his face. "That's the first step toward freedom." As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the garden, Sydney realized the killer's plan was working. She was being isolated, not through walls and locks, but through a shared secret of violence and attraction. The seduction of fear was complete. She was no longer running. She was waiting for the final reveal, her body humming with a dangerous, expectant energy that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The storm outside was no longer just weather, it was a rhythmic assault, a percussion of thunder and rain that turned Sydney's glass-walled sanctuary into a shivering, translucent cage. Inside, the power had surrendered to the elements, leaving the house in a state of amber-hued suspense, lit only by the dying embers in the fireplace and the erratic, strobe-like flashes of lightning. Sydney stood by the hearth, the heat of the fire a sharp contrast to the damp chill clinging to the windows. She had changed into a slip of midnight blue silk, the fabric so delicate it seemed to move with her breath. She held a glass of bourbon, the amber liquid catching the light, but she hadn't tasted it. She was listening. Not to the storm, but to the silence of the man standing in the shadows behind her. Julian hadn't moved for 10 minutes. He was a silhouette against the hallway, a dark, grounded presence that felt like the eye of the storm. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to travel through the floorboards before it reached her ears. "You're waiting for the ending, aren't you, Sydney?" He stepped into the firelight. He had discarded his overcoat, and his white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the steady, calm pulse in his throat. He looked at her not with the frantic eyes of a killer, but with the heavy, focused gaze of a man who had finally reached the climax of a long-awaited performance. "I'm waiting for the truth," Sydney said, her voice a silk-wrapped blade. She turned to face him, the firelight dancing across the curves of her body. She didn't step back. In the soap opera of her life, she had played the victim, the survivor, and the legend. Tonight, she was the architect. "The truth is that you've never been more beautiful than you are right now," Julian whispered, moving into her personal space. The air between them was thick, charged with a static tension that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her waist, the heat of his palm radiating through the thin silk. "Stripped of the sheriff, stripped of the town's expectations. Just you and the shadow that's been chasing you." "Is that what you are, Julian? The shadow?" He smiled, a slow, dark tilt of his lips. "I'm the one who stayed. I'm the one who didn't look away when you were broken. I'm the one who understands that your strength isn't in your survival, but in the way you want to be seen." He stepped even closer, his chest nearly brushing hers. The ambiguity of his presence was a physical weight. He wasn't reaching for a knife, he was reaching for her. He placed his hand on the small of her back, his fingers splayed against the silk, and pulled her toward him with a slow, dominant pressure. The calls, the letters, the flowers, they weren't threats, Sydney. They were a confession of faith. A way to strip away the polished lies of this town until only the core of you remained. "A culling," she breathed, echoing his words from the garden. "A culling," he agreed, his voice dropping to a seductive, dangerous register. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "And now, the field is clear. There's no one left to watch us. No one left to write the script but us." The phone on the mantel began to ring. The sound was jarring, a digital scream in the intimate silence of the room. Sydney's heart hammered a frantic rhythm, but she didn't pull away from Julian's hold. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and picked it up. She pressed it to her ear, her eyes never leaving Julian's. "You're strongest when you're cornered," the voice said on the other end. It was the same intimate, controlled purr. But this time, it was perfectly synchronized with the movement of Julian's lips as he whispered into her other ear. "I wonder how close I need to stand to see it again." Sydney felt a jolt of pure, electric realization. Julian wasn't just the listener, he was the voice. He was the one who had choreographed her trauma into a dark, romantic duet. The realization didn't bring terror, it brought a strange, dark clarity. The hunter and the prey had finally met in the center of the maze. Julian eased the phone from her hand and set it on the mantel. He didn't move away. He stepped even closer, his body a solid, overwhelming weight against hers. He looked down at her, his dark eyes searching hers for the break, for the surrender. "You thought it was about killing, Sydney? No. It's about knowing you. It's about being the only one who truly sees the woman behind the mask." He reached up, his thumb tracing the line of her lip with a rhythmic, hypnotic pressure. The proximity was stifling, the scent of sandalwood and rain now mixed with the metallic tang of the storm. It was a moment of profound, dangerous intimacy. "Now you know," he whispered. "What are you going to do, Sydney? Are you going to fight? Or are you going to acknowledge that for the first time in your life, you're not alone?" Sydney looked at him, her gaze sharpening, the fire in her eyes reflecting the dying embers of the hearth. She didn't step back. She didn't scream. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him down until their foreheads touched. "I understand the game now, Julian," she said, her voice a low, sultry growl that sent a shiver through him. "And you're right. I'm strongest when I'm cornered." She flipped the dominance in a single fluid movement, her hand tightening in his hair. The tension between them was no longer just psychological, it was a physical duel of wills. But then, the house went completely dark. The fire died. The storm outside gave one final bone-shaking roar of thunder. In the absolute blackness, a second phone began to ring. It wasn't the house phone. It wasn't Sydney's. It was a small burner phone vibrating on the floor near the entrance. Sydney pulled away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She reached for the phone, the screen illuminating her face with a ghostly blue light. A different voice. Same tone. "You've always been the final girl, Sydney." The new voice whispered, the sound cold and clinical. "But who's writing the sequel?" Julian froze. He looked toward the darkened hallway, his face a mask of sudden, genuine confusion.